Okay, everybody, we are back to finish up the last video in how I made this black Renaissance dress. We're going to do history of it a bit later, but today our focus is on those epic sleeves. As just a heads up, I have this sleeve pattern from doing years of this sort of costuming, so I don't really have a making of the pattern. I already cut out the lining, and now it's time to go cut out all of the layers that I have for the sleeve. So right now we've got my inner lining in a super lightweight linen that I'm going to need to press here in a bit. And we're going to use that to cut out the black velvet that goes on top of everything. Just a note, because it's so dark and I'm on a black table, it didn't really show up in the cutting process, but you can start to see some floofs of the velvet as we get that fabric cut out. These are the pattern weights that I made last year as part of just a quick project I was working on. I'll go ahead and link that video down in the description notes if you're curious about how to make those after this one. On this particular project, I did find that the velvet being napped side up and using the felt bottoms of the sewing weights, pattern weights to keep everything down did make this process a bit easier since I wasn't pinning the pattern directly into the silk velvet netting situation that we have with this velvet. After I was done cutting that out, I needed to make some strips. If you've already watched my how to make the dress video, which will be down in the description as well, you might have seen a little bit of this. If not, just to recap, I made some straight of grain strips of black velvet based off of this remnant scrap I had in my stash, and I start binding everything else off with it. First, I needed to mark out my strips in even intervals. I am not marking this all the way across. Instead, I'm going to just clip through the edge and I'm going to rip these. And that's because based off of the training I had working in a fabric store as a teenager, you can straighten up the edge on the velvet doing this. After you've straightened up those edges, ripping it will also help keep these strips straight on grain. And I did check after I'd squared the edge that each of these strips was the same width on each side to just kind of verify that I did get everything back straight on grain. I find this way a little bit easier. It's actually a little bit cathartic at some points in your life just to go out and rip fabric. But if you are scared of it, you can flip the velvet over so that you're drawing on the ground side of it, not the plushy side, and draw out those lines. Whatever is going to be easiest for you. I prefer this because it was much quicker and simpler. I decided that the velvet sleeve material needed to have a backing. That was after going back and looking at some of my research books, which I'll try and reference down in the description, as well as just looking at the fabric. It's a silk net with a velvet pile that creates a design, and it just was not stable on its own. And the lightweight linen lining I picked out was not going to stabilize it. So I picked up some white silk shantung out of my stash, ironed it flat, got it cut out, had to re-iron it because this got put away for a while. And then I ended up basting this awesome velvet onto that. It makes life so much easier to handle the silk black velvet when I'm not trying to deal with it wiggling everywhere. So if you're working with the stuff in this capacity for a Renaissance or basically anything before fabrics were really popular, I would definitely encourage backing it just to make sure that everything is stable and stays in place. With basting this, I really did not want to have to unpick a whole bunch of stitches, so I tried to use large running stitches or basting stitches to hold the two layers together. By basting them together as one fabric, I was able to more easily sew everything together without worrying about the fabric shifting on me. So you can do this by going just outside of the seam allowance and doing some very large stitches and pulling it through. I liked to do this in a contrasting thread that I knew I would see. For this project, white was the obvious choice since the fashion fabric is that very inky black. I picked out this particular silk scarf for this project while I was out thrifting, not necessarily because I found it, but it gave a really close approximation to one of the ways we think that these sleeves might have been put together. So there's a bunch of really gorgeous sleeves from 16th century Italy around mid-century to later part of the century, where we can't tell if they're necessarily cut work, if it's voided velvet on something like this, or is it an applique. So Daisy Victoria did a great video on doing cut work sleeves for her Lady Loki in the Renaissance dress that she did. I'll go ahead and put a card up here if you want to take a look at that one. But kind of my lesson with this dress has been that there's more than one way to do this. If you have a way that's working for you and you've done the research to make sure it's going to at least have some basis, definitely give it a go. It's worth the effort to try. I also like to remind folks that just like our sewers today have multiple ways of doing something, the local seamstresses and tailors and all of those folks that were in the garment construction industry had their own little methods and ways to cut time and save whatever work they could. So keep that in mind as you're looking at stuff and going, oh no, this is the only way to do something. Maybe the more common way, but that doesn't always work for everybody. These sleeves are going to be bag lined like a modern sleeve that we do for just about anything else. I tried thinking through how to flat line it and then maybe whip stitch up along the edge of that silk netting. Problem I was getting concerned about is the possibility of the stitches getting caught on something or me damaging that silk net. So I just pinned everything together, made sure it was stable, and I ran it through the sewing machine with all of the net enclosed with the voided velvet and just sewed over the white silk shantung. Once those sleeves were sewn together, I then had to go back and finish ironing the linen that you saw me cutting out at the top of the video. That's gonna make the lining to help protect the outer fashion fabric in general from sweats or any stains, anything like that from me, in addition to any kamisha I'm wearing. I went and sewed all of the sleeves together and then put them so that all of the raw seams would be facing each other. And I changed my mind one more time and didn't quite bagline it. I decided that both the top and the bottom, not just one edge, we're going to get that binding. So after sewing the binding on to keep everything in place on the top and bottom, I have to go through and get the raw edges of the binding adjusted so that I can stitch it down by hand. This was one of the most fiddly portions of this project because the velvet is trying to imitate the slipperiness of a silk velvet. And then the voided black silk velvet for the fashion fabric was also kind of moving around and doing some interesting things. Not as bad as if the silk shantung hadn't been there, but it was trying. So take your time if you're working with fabrics like this. It is always worth it to do extra pins, basting, anything else you can do when you're working with napped fabric, nap being that fuzzy section like on a velvet. you will regret it if you don't take your time and then start just running through things and suddenly your velvet is all bunched up on one end or it's going off in weird ways because it likes to crawl around. If you're finding these sewing vlogs and costuming tutorials helpful at all, I would love it if you would subscribe for more sewing adventures with us over here. And at the same time, just give my video a simple like if it's been helpful. That really means the world, and it lets me know that these are the sort of projects and videos that you would like to see more of. My question of the week for you is going to be, what is a portion of your project that you put off towards the end? Inevitably, when I'm doing one of these 16th century Italian dresses, my last thing is going to be getting the sleeves done. I wait till the end for that. But I know some people that would do the sleeves, but then wait to do their hem. So let me know in the comments, what is the last part of a project or the last part of an outfit that you work on? Once my binding's in place, I actually go through and I start doing a simple little hemming slip stitch situation. I don't want to have a lot of free floating threads from doing a normal whip stitch, so I'm trying to keep any surface threads to be hidden as much as possible. And that's mostly just knowing my nails as I try to put my arm through these armholes and the wrist. I will totally catch any open, even vaguely loose whip stitch threads with a nail and then pop a seam and be very unhappy with myself all day at an event. So I did work this around the pins because, like I was saying earlier with velvet, it likes to move. I might have used fewer pins and this would have been less time consuming, but I might have ended up with more velvet crawling than I wanted. Something to keep in mind while you're sewing these bindings down as well, if you choose to do that, is your tension, if you start pulling it tight, is going to pucker slightly on the inside. It didn't really bother me too much, but if it bothers you, just be aware of it. In period, from what I've seen in some of my research books, the sleeves, if they were tie-on sleeves like this, normally would have an eyelet worked into them. I don't have any surviving tissue sleeves like these, so it was hard to tell if they were also just running an awl and working eyelets through that tissue silk velvet situation. I was a little bit concerned about it getting frayed out because I don't have a whole lot of this fabric left. It's kind of delicate. It was a vintage thrift flip from the thrift store, so it's not something I will easily find again. So we're doing lacing rings. These are a thing that they use in some portions of clothing from this time period, and I can just tie between this and a lacing ring in the shoulder of my dress, have a cute little bow on my shoulder, and get my sleeve secured onto the dress in an easy way that puts the fabric at as little risk of tearing as possible while I'm moving my shoulder around. It was a concern because shoulders tend to be a stress point. The wrist binding goes quite a bit faster because it's less fabric, and I'd already really practiced doing this double fold. Fold in the raw edge, fold the fold up to my machine sewn seam, and then stick a pin in that to mark where I want to start my hand sewing. As much as I could, I tried to hand sew the seam around the fold and into that machine sewn seam. It also prevented too many obvious stitches out in the world as I was trying to hand sew the binding on. Finishing the edges of these binding always gets to be a little bit interesting. I came through and clipped off some of the excess edge on one side of it, and then kind of just fiddled with it to try and make it as flat as I could. Then afterwards, I pinned that newly flattened half of my binding back into place and start messing with the now longer end that's going to come up and over that raw edge. I don't need it to be super long and have a large amount of fabric, so I rip off a little bit of the extra. And I'm going to keep just enough that I can go past the edge of my current fabric and any folding it might have, tuck the raw edge in, and then pin all of that in place so that all of my raw edges get encapsulated in my seams and I don't have anything hanging out, especially with velvet and other napped fabrics. If you have raw edges, it's going to start fraying quite a bit. But with the bindings all sewn together, it was officially time to start taking out all of my basting stitches. I wasn't as observant as I should have been when I was sewing with the machine. I did end up sewing through the basting in a few spots. It served its purpose, it did keep everything together, but it did make it just slightly harder to get out of my sleeves. So just keep that in mind if you're doing this too. With the netting nature of that ground voided velvet situation, I had to be really careful when I was pulling this out to make sure that I didn't cause a hole or tear the netting ground fabric. This situation would probably be a great use for an old kind of blunt seam ripper that will still get into places where you need it to, but it's not terribly sharp, so it probably won't stab through the netting or do anything too untoward to your fabric. Something that I had to remember was not only to take the basting stitches out of the arm's eye area that was holding everything together and clip any missing threads from my machine sewing, but I also had to go down the length of my sleeve just because I did have those two sort of interior sleeve seams that would have something going down on either side. So double check that you get all of your threads, because I stopped so many times thinking I was done, then I would see a white basting stitch somewhere. Don't these sleeves just give the best effect for this dress? I love that they tie on so they're not under super strain, and I'll have them for years to come to mix and match with multiple dresses. And they just add this extra texture layer to my dress that I couldn't have asked for anything better. They are a sort of Art Nouveau inspired Renaissance pattern rather than being a direct copy, but I'm still happy with it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day.